Morning, good afternoon, wherever you may be. My name is Dr. Jennifer Donaldson-Novitska, and I'm the director of the Catholic Institute of Sacred Music. I'm so delighted you're able to join us today for this lecture by our illustrious guest, Sir James MacMillan. The Catholic Institute of Sacred Music is based at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park, California, and we offer graduate level training for musicians, especially aimed at cultivating excellence in the practice of sacred music and in the Christian life in those who work in Catholic parishes and schools. Our 36 credit Master of Sacred Music degree program launches this summer, pending approval from our accreditors. And sorry, I'm letting a few more people in here. As well as our two post-baccalaureate certificates, one in Gregorian chant and the other in sacred choral music. The application deadline for the degree and certificates is coming up February 15th. And the deadline, if you would like to apply for our James A. McInnes paid choral fellowship for 12 outstanding singers, is also that same day, February 15th. If you plan to apply as a non-degree seeking student taking just a few classes, the deadline is May 1st. Also, our public outreach this semester begins, of course, with this lecture and follows on Monday with the launch of our Spring Monday online workshops, beginning with a session on singing the readings at Mass, and moving into a three-part series on the history of the Requiem, which is being taught by someone I see in this chat, Dr. Eric Arenas. We invite you to join us for these and many other upcoming events available on our website. Catholic Institute of Sacred Music.org. Just a little bit about the etiquette for today. I will be monitoring the chat box, so you can feel free to put a question in the box at any time. Don't wait until the end. It's usually a better flow for a conversation if you've outlined your thoughts in the chat box as we go. And you can feel free to put your questions in there with knowing that I'll just be monitoring that and you won't be distracting anybody. And you can enter then back more fully into the session, not worrying about whether you'll forget your question or not. And we ask you to remain muted throughout this entire session today. There may be some time at the end to have you pose your questions aloud. And only at that point would the video pick up your or the recording rather pick up your video. Otherwise, you are invisible to the video recording. So the composer's challenge of writing a Mass setting in the 16th century presented itself on a more local level, a setting to be sung in a certain place and time, mindful of the wishes of a patron, and perhaps with a mind towards publication and use elsewhere. Received in an environment integrally linked to liturgical practice, a Mass did not have to make a case for its existence. Even in the 19th century, the liturgical practice yet served as a justification for the text, which might now be set for a concert setting aimed at dramatic effect, particularly in the Requiem. But what can be said today? Mass settings are heard in the liturgical context only by a small subset of people. And the average Catholic who regularly attends Mass rarely hears something approaching the artistic integrity of a Mass by Palestrina or Reinberger. The average concertgoer, too, rarely hears a Mass, and then usually only the occasional Requiem, which for them has lost its cultural cachet as something used in religious practice. The Mass presents in our time as an artifact of some long-lost culture, perhaps interesting as a museum piece or an homage to a bygone era. Catholic practice for the average parish, too, is often yet bereft of the hearing of artistically substantial works, presenting a challenge for the intrepid music director to help Catholics feel at home in beautiful works which might otherwise seem to them as a concert at Mass. There are many miles to be traversed to plant the seeds of a rich culture for the reception of the Mass, and certainly participants in this session today are engaged in this project of the re-Christianization of culture and re-sacralization of liturgical practice. The current culture presents a particular challenge and an opportunity for the modern composer. Can one compose something that stands on its own as artistically significant in a concert setting, so as to draw people into the mysteries bespoken? And yet, can it be actually used in the liturgical setting, fulfilling the purposes and qualities of sacred music the Church requires? Or perhaps the concert aspect is to be shriven altogether, focusing again on the local instantiation as in olden times, again focusing on a culture of lived liturgical practice. Sir James MacMillan has been writing masses for a long time in his illustrious career and is uniquely skilled in our time at writing, which makes a case for the Mass, preaching the mysteries of the Mass to the concert going audience, and yet writing for parish and cathedral choirs, music the Church gladly receives as part of the treasury of sacred music. We are so delighted to have him here with us today to share his thoughts on this matter, so important to a revitalization of a culture of new compositions in the Church today, and to share a little bit about his voluminous oeuvre with you. And I see many composers amongst the attendees today, especially some movements from his own masses. So without further ado, Sir James MacMillan.
Thank you, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. First of all, I'm delighted that Archbishop Cordileone invited me to give this lecture today, and I very much appreciate, Jennifer, in the way that you've facilitated it all coming about today. Before I begin, I should warn you that I've developed a bit of a cold, or what my wife refers to as a man cold, with the implication it's not very serious. It probably isn't, but it does mean that my delivery might be a little more spluttering and deeper than usual. So as well as having to put up with my indecipherable Scottish accent, you've got a lot of snuffling and coughing perhaps. If something goes terribly wrong, I might just put the mute on while I have a quick cough, and then I'll get back to you as soon as possible. So without further ado then, ladies and gentlemen, composers have been writing music for the liturgy and setting the words of the ordinary of the Mass for a millennia. Most of these composers, even in the very early days, would have had experience of musical life in the secular environment too, one way or another. Sometimes, even in the Middle Ages and in pre-Reformation times, the music of the secular world might seep into the sacred context, sometimes subliminally, sometimes deliberately. Sometimes this could be controversial, other times not. And when we get to the time of J.S. Bach, he would compose abundantly for secular purposes, sometimes in the public realm, sometimes in the domestic realm. We have masterpieces from him that prove he was as comfortable outside the church as well as inside. We have his many concertos and orchestral and keyboard suites as proof of this, from a composer who spent much of his life in the employ of ecclesiastical foundations for which he would produce weekly cantatas. He never wrote an opera, but it is clear from his music, sacred and secular, that he was aware of the new form emanating from Italy and spreading all over Europe, and that he admired and was beguiled by its dramatic potential and aesthetic. By the time we get to Haydn and Mozart, we see composers moving easily and fluently between secular and ecclesial worlds, between opera and mass setting, between motet and symphony, between concerto and oratorio. This was the natural confluence between the earthly and the heavenly that composers would take for granted. It's not like that now. The historical breach has forced composers into taking one path or another in many cases. The Church's engagement with the living arts seems weak and shrunken these days, and many in the arts look with indifference at the Church, which they see as irrelevant to their lives. In the online introduction to this event, Jennifer has written and has said that the current culture presents a particular challenge and opportunity for the modern composer. Can one compose something that stands on its own as artistically significant in a concert setting, so as to draw people into the mysteries bespoken, and yet can it be actually used in a liturgical setting, fulfilling the purposes and qualities of sacred music the Church requires? Or perhaps the concert aspect is to be shriven altogether, focusing again on the local instantiation as in olden times, again focusing on a culture of lived liturgical practice. These issues, these challenges and dilemmas are in my mind a lot as a composer who spends a lot of my time and energy creating music for various secular contexts, as someone who is also a committed Catholic, a Catholic who's faithful and engaged in our liturgical life, and someone who feels drawn to contribute something of my musical energies to that liturgy. My talk today then will attempt to explore some of my thoughts on this and on related matters. At a recent conference on Jacques Maritain, I was struck by this quote, which highlighted his belief in the artist's mission to, quote, shelter the prayer, instruct the intelligence, and rejoice the eyes and the soul, providing an inspiring mandate to investigate the problems, the principles, and complexities of artistry in the modern era. I didn't know too much about Jacques and Roisa Maritain, but I became intrigued by their engagement with the main cultural players of their age, who were well placed in the heartland of the birth of modern art. And as a composer, I've become fascinated that they had close intellectual connections with Stravinsky and Eric Satie, as well as Guide, Mauriac, Cocteau, Picasso, and Chagall. I was also struck by a couple of quotes in a New Statesman article by one Maddock Cairns, which points to the Maritain's centrality in the cultural and intellectual upheavals of the recent past. This, for example, he said, the long interregnum of secular modernity was drawing to an apocalyptic close. And amid the unfolding catastrophe of the Second World War, Maritain saw a new Christendom rising from the ashes of the old. And then he says, Maritain's pluralism isn't laïcité, the exclusion of religion from public life. Christianity would animate his new society as the soul animates the body. We might quibble with Cairns's advocacy of a new Christendom, and although these observations follow a wide sweep of politics, aesthetics, and contemporary artistic vision and endeavour, there are profound implications here for a composer in these times. Maritain's vision of the church in modernity is not the usual accommodating kowtowing to powerful secular elites, beloved of leftists in the churches, but a bold and radical taking of control and direction. His rising from the ashes and his suggestion that Christianity could re-sacralize our culture, reanimating the toxic, broken body of contemporary culture, makes Maritain one of the boldest and courageous figures to emerge in modern Catholicism. His interrogation of how Christianity in our time can engage with its deep traditions and history, and in the process not just cohabit with the modern secular world, but lead it, is inspiring at so many different levels. Is there something in this initiative which might have a musical analogy? Can a composer learn from his deep engagements with the past and the present? Well, as a composer, I think about music's deep past and how the living world of contemporary composition is, isn't, can, can't, should, or should not be impacted by it. It has actually been the main and major debate in the new music world all of my lifetime. Composers are assessed according to their radicalism or safetyism, innovation or conservatism, and how cutting edge and avant-garde or nostalgic and traditionalist they are. I have the scars to prove it. Depending on who is doing the assessing, my own music has been described on one hand by one tribe as esoteric and difficult, and by another as old-fashioned and backward-looking. So, is there something in Maritain's endeavours which can point the way for the likes of me, who happens to be, like him, a Catholic? I am the first to admit that it's quite an odd situation to find myself in, being a composer who's at home in the business of serious art music and its modernity, and simultaneously being interested in what might work as functional ritual music in the Catholic liturgy in the times we live. Most of my work is geared towards the concert life of our orchestras, chamber ensembles, soloists, conductors, and choirs. The culture of art music as it evolves now in the 21st century is my intellectual and imaginative home. I write for orchestras and virtuosi, such as the Minnesota Orchestra, the LA Phil, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, and Nicola Benedetti, the great Scottish violin soloist, as well as the great choirs such as the 16 and the BBC Singers. In earlier times, this kind of work would naturally overlap with composing music for liturgy, whether it be the weekly cantatas written by Bach for Lutheran worship, or the regular masses and motets composed by Palestrina through Mozart towards Bruckner and beyond. We don't need to rehearse the historical and cultural reasons why there have been breaches between ecclesial authorities and classical composers. Gradually, over the decades, one has become more and more disinterested in the other. So much so that it is thought unusual to find composers enthusiastically pursuing both aspirations. It might only be recently that this breach has become serious, as we can think of many composers, even as late as the 20th century, who followed the two paths. Poulenc and Messiaen in France, Benjamin Britten in the United Kingdom, and even Stravinsky with his mass setting and little motets like his Ave Maria and Pater Noster. With the Second Vatican Council came another serious breach, though. It has become almost impossible for the Church to interest the contemporary art composer in writing new congregational music for the liturgy. Choral music still has its attractions, even for the most complex of modernists. Here in the United Kingdom, composers such as Peter Maxwell Davies wrote a mass setting for Westminster Cathedral, and Jonathan Harvey had a natural Anglican instinct for cathedral and church choirs. Both of these men are now dead, and the gulf is getting wider. Neither would have been inspired, unfortunately, one might say, to write functional music for the non-specialist worshipper in the pew. Bernard Huybers was the foremost forerunner in the new ideas for congregational music in the wake of Vatican II, and he made the case that the new active participation should require a new kind of liturgical music and a new kind of liturgical composer. He advised that the Church's historical repertoire of sacred art music and its associated performance traditions should be abandoned. My colleague Michael Ferguson in the University of St Andrews wrote this: "In an ideological sense too, he regards sacred music as no longer having a legitimate place." And Huybers refers to art musicians and the sacred traditions of the Church as a kind of, quote, musical colonialism. It's odd to see that a Catholic cultural warrior of the 1960s could be so prophetic of the widespread chaos created by today's culture warriors in the secular world, who use similar language about our entire cultural history. One could argue that this radical stance has gained much purchase in the Church of today and is the cause of many musicians turning away from liturgical concerns, and for the many clergy and liturgists who regard serious musicians as surplus to contemporary requirements, unnecessary and unwanted. Generally, it has caused bewilderment among musicians outside the Church, who see the willful abandonment of tradition and practice as a kind of iconoclasm, associated more with the Protestant Reformations of past centuries, or the kind of communist culture wars instigated in 1960s China, 1970s Cambodia, or in the student unions of American and British campuses of the present day. Nevertheless, There are pockets of insight where other, alternative, and far less destructive understandings of Catholic liturgical development still hold sway. On the one hand, of course, it's still possible to compose choral music for skillful choirs and organists in the church, usually in big cities in this country, London, Liverpool, and in establishments where money is available for the maintenance of professional standards. And there are enough people still around in the Catholic Church who hold a much more nuanced understanding of how congregational song might be. There have been competing ideas as to how music in the liturgy should and might develop and grow these last 50 years. On the one hand, there has been Pope Benedict and others who hold that church tradition can indeed provide effective models which can give good orientation for composers in the modern age, and that post-conciliar liturgical music can be of pastoral impact in the vernacular, but can simultaneously draw deeply from the wells of Catholic heritage and sound. And then there is Edward Schaeffer, the American academic and musician, who optimistically sees the modern situation as, quote, ripe for improvement, suggesting that the various historical and ideological trends can be rebalanced, and he sees an ongoing role in this for Gregorian chant. I have certainly then been aware of these different forces, sometimes pulling the church in opposing directions. I can see potency and persuasiveness in many of the strong and sometimes vehement arguments. Over the years, I've attempted to compose congregational music, including 3 Mass settings. However, let me first address the modern secular world of new classical music for the concert hall. As I said earlier, the culture of art music as it evolves now in the 21st century is my intellectual and imaginative home. There was something in the high modernism of the late 20th century which favoured instrumental music over choral or even vocal music. The virtuosity and complexity so sought after by modernist composers could be attained more easily with instruments. In fact, a lot of the vocal music of the 20th century front-line modernists is deeply instrumental in conception, mimicking the lithe and athletic twists and turns that could be achieved by instrumental specialists. Therefore, the instincts more associated with song and choir were downgraded and replaced by alternative creative priorities. This, I think, explains my temporary drifting away from choral music in my younger years, a time when I was beguiled by the pushing of boundaries associated with major modernist composers, from Schoenberg to Boulez. There was also at this time, in the 1980s, a reticence on my part to show my hand as a religious composer, having been persuaded temporarily that religion had no place at the cutting edge of modern artistic endeavour. I was wrong. No doubt encouraged by the likes of Olivier Messiaen and later those deeply spiritual voices emerging from the shadows of Soviet state-enforced atheism, like Schnittke, Gubaidulina, Arvo Pärt, Goretzky, and so on, I turned back to my original instincts and slowly but surely began building a body of work for choral forces, much of which was shaped by my liturgical and theological experiences as a Catholic. Also, it was not clear in the 1970s and 1980s that imminently there would be a huge resurgence of interest in choral music, which would become such a prominent feature of musical life, especially perhaps in the United Kingdom, and indeed in the lives of many composers at the end of the century and into this one. I did not foresee the intense imaginative relationship that I would eventually build with Harry Christophers, the conductor of the 16, for example. And I did not foresee just how much the new brilliant British choral ensembles would feature in the work of the modern composer, the 16, Tenebrae, Polyphony, the Tallis Scholars, the Hilliard Ensemble, the King Singers. For a while, from about 2005, I became interested in what Edward Schaeffer described as the rebalancing of trends in liturgical music practice in the Catholic Church. As I said earlier, Pope Benedict took a great interest in the Church's music, and I was struck by this quote from him, speaking in the Sistine Chapel in 2006. He said, "An authentic updating of sacred music can take place in the lineage of the great tradition of the past, of Gregorian chant and sacred polyphony." I suppose I have always been intrigued by the practical, aesthetic, and stylistic possibilities of the old and the new coming together. Could the deep traditions, musical, philosophical, and religious, that are so dear to me, be channeled anew in the sonic languages of this present age? Could Maritain's view of art in our own time lead to a music as a natural virtue of creative making and imagination in modernity? Could contemporary music, for the Church or for the world, continue to be a function of practical intellect? Could a modern composer pursue the objective nature of music and his or her role in revealing truth and beauty in music of the 21st century? How might modern music, to quote Maritain again, shelter the prayer and rejoice the ears and the soul? To pursue these questions, I thought it might be a useful idea to focus on my settings of the Mass, setting the words of the Mass to music in the secular environment of our time, a Catholic composer's experience. Over the years, I've set the words of the Mass 9 times, and I'm just about to embark on a 10th. There are 4 choral settings and 3 congregational settings. All of these, 7, were written for actual liturgical use. As well as these, I've written a concert work called Little Mass, which sets 3 Mass sections and is scored for children's voices and orchestra. It's quite a big piece though, the Kyrie, Sanctus and Agnus Dei movements lasting about 10 minutes each. There was no intention that this piece would be used for liturgy. I'll come to that piece a little later. And then there is a setting of the Requiem Mass, but again this is a concert piece too. The various texts are brought together in a single movement, a single through composed work, more like an uninterrupted Requiem symphony, again purely for concert performance. This work has a curious genesis, as it is entitled A European Requiem. There's a reasoning behind this, and if I might digress slightly for a little while, in my program note I wrote, whereas Brahms stepped out of line to use German texts overtly in Ein Deutsches Requiem, it may be somewhat ironic that the language I feel drawn back to is Latin, which represents for me the common European language that existed before national barriers were erected. It was the lingua franca used by the European founding fathers, whether in Roman times or in the Church, and provided a source of common identity for a millennium and a half in international relations, education, and the sharing of ideas. Setting texts in Latin may now seem countercultural to many, but for me, it represents the ideal rediscovering of a common heritage. Now, I wrote this piece for the Oregon Bach Festival in 2016 and arrived there to hear it just days after the Brexit referendum. There was general and widespread misunderstandings about the title, A European Requiem, and I had to endure days of baffling American questions about David Cameron and Nigel Farage. The piece has nothing to do with Brexit. The situation wasn't helped a few years ago when the BBC Proms programmed it in the same concert as Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. And as you probably know, the last movement of this has the tune that the European Union uses as an anthem. So even the BBC thought it was a Brexit piece too. And I had to endure a Royal Albert Hall performance full of activists waving European Union flags all night. Anyway, as I say, I digress. My relationship with the idea of setting the Mass to music began in 1976, when I composed my first. My Missa Brevis was written when I was 17. My high school choir sang the Sanctus that year, and then I forgot about it, the piece, for decades. I resurrected it in 2007 when the Scottish choir, Capella Nova, performed it and recorded it. I have noticed that it has been taken up by various Catholic choirs and pressed into liturgical service, which pleases me greatly. I remember at the time being fascinated by the idea of the modern art music composer writing specifically for the Catholic Mass. The examples from the 20th century that I looked to were by Stravinsky, Kodály, Benjamin Britten, and Lennox Berkeley. Looking back at my own Missa Brevis, the style seems to be imbued with the Renaissance and Baroque choral works that I was discovering with my high school choir, as well as music by Britten and Kenneth Layton, with whom I started composition lessons a few years later. The Kyrie seems to grow out of the world of the Bird four-part Mass, which I remember singing and studying as a teenager. I recognise in this early piece of mine that the interweaving parts, absorbed perhaps from the bird, could create a parallel sense of peaceful flow. Although at the time, as a teenager in Ayrshire, Scotland, I didn't have access to a choir that could sing the piece fully, properly and liturgically, the aspiration was certainly there. I do remember being aware that I was meant to be writing music, the effect of which was hopefully to aid contemplation and devotion. Although I can see my younger self working out the counterpoint and relatively layered complexity, the music here is mostly quite simple and immediately direct. Perhaps from that early age, I had an inkling of what the Catholic liturgy required from its music and from its composers in modernity. The piece, though, was composed before I had read any explorative writings on liturgical music, but I feel that my basic instincts were confirmed and encouraged by subsequent study, especially in the writings of Ratzinger and in the writings of the Dominican Aidan Nichols, who was my Catholic chaplain during my undergraduate years at the University of Edinburgh. I thought it might be an idea at this point to play you an excerpt from the Sanctus of my Missa Brevis, just to let you hear what about the style and the aesthetic that I'm talking about. Thank you. The next time I was to compose another choral setting of the Mass was at the end of the millennium, and it was in English. It was commissioned by Westminster Cathedral and premiered and recorded in the year 2000. It's very different from the Missa Brevis, written nearly a quarter century earlier. At the time, I wrote that the music was crafted like a journey which mirrors the progression of mood, emphasis, and poetic tension in the liturgy. From the penitential rite to the joyous hymn of the Gloria, to the mysteries of the consecration, through to the reflective ambiguities of the Agnus Dei, the music moves from clarity to a sense of uneasy resolution. My original program note from 2000 says that the music was, quote, written through experience of the tragedies and uncertainties of our own age. It is inevitable that a contemporary celebration of divine love should be shrouded in the doubts and fears which characterize our time. Although this might be debatable, perhaps this remark points to the bigger issue of how one can bring the language or languages of musical modernity into the timeless nature of the Catholic Mass. Stravinsky did it in his setting, and Britten did it in his own Missa Brevis. The Church is clearly open, therefore, to the possibility of its precious liturgy being able to embrace and absorb the aesthetics and the styles that modern musical culture can bring to the table, or in this case, to the altar of God. Sometimes this works well, sometimes not. The drama of the liturgy is always important to me, so I have to search for the right atmosphere and a sense of mystery. There is virtuosic organ writing in this setting, which is unexpected perhaps and adds an angularity and a busy melodic contrast to the more settled choral writing. In the Gloria, for example, the high organ material seems to work against the more settled tonality in the choral writing, producing a sense of polytonality. The effect is to nudge or edge the joy of the hymn onto unexpected territory. There's an ambiguity in the mood, a tension between serenity and something else, something unknown and distant. The Sanctus, I suppose, is an attempt on my part to capture the glimpse of the heavenly hosts in the book of Revelation, which is evoked at this point in the Mass. The movement builds up a very extended crescendo, which starts very low, low F sharps in the basses, pianissimo, and grows to a massive climax. The Hosanna needs an agile organist and includes more of the vocal ornamentation, which I have enjoyed exploring over the years. The Benedictus follows segue and is slow-moving, eventually building to another huge Hosanna, which subsides again into the dark abyss from which the Sanctus began. I'll come back to the Sanctus in a minute. I just want to say something about the Agnus Dei. The Agnus Dei is technically and vocally more difficult than the other movements, and in finding its way to a kind of resolution in its grant us peace, I am attempting to paint the picture in music reflecting these doubts and fears which characterize our time. The final repetitions of the word peace are punctuated by low clusters on the organ, which can sometimes sound unnervingly like distant explosions. There is nothing new in this, though. In Beethoven's Missa Solemnis, the Agnus Dei in particular, one can hear the military tread of trumpets and drums, perhaps evoking the tensions and indeed the war that he would be witnessing in Austria and the centre of Europe at that time. So let me return to the Sanctus, and let us hear now the Sanctus from my Mass for the Millennium. So, my second choral Mass is, in comparison to the earlier Missa Brevis, very full and complex, florid and unbridled in its expressivity, I suppose, its word painting and emotion. It's a piece which has gathered in a range of compositional techniques, which I had been exposed to and developed in my wider work over the years up until the age of 40 or so. The flotsam and jetsam of modernism is clearly detectable throughout the Mass, but the allusions to atonality are always controlled by a sense of tonal rootedness and modal primacy. It's a challenging thing to sing, and only the best choirs could do justice to it. In this country, it's used in Westminster Cathedral and by some of the top Anglican choirs. It's a world away from my congregational settings of the same text, but it perhaps points to my conviction that there should be a wide range of possibilities available for the Church, that there should be a wide range of possibilities available for the Church when it comes to its liturgical music. I'll just briefly comment on my congregational masses. In a sense, it's a different topic, a different subject, and I don't want to complicate matters, confuse matters by talking too much about them. But I've written 3 congregational settings. a St. Anne's Mass, which was originally written for children, and it's the simplest of the lot. A Galloway Mass, which was written for my diocese here in Galloway, in Scotland, and the Mass for the papal visit of Benedict when he came to the United Kingdom in 2010, the Mass for the Blessed John Henry Newman, which was used at the beatification ceremony at Cofton Park, but also in Bellahouston Park in Glasgow. Very public celebrations, open air. A difficult context to write music for. If you want to explore them, there is some YouTube video of the Papal Mass from Cofton Park. Anyway, for my final example, I'd like to focus on a passage from my Little Mass. I wrote this, as I say, for children to sing with an orchestra. It is a concert work, not a liturgical setting. For that reason, I've expanded the context. Each movement, the Kyrie, Sanctus and Agnus Dei, has been opened up, both in duration and in scope, but also perhaps in imagination. The music explores the emotional and theological depth and width of the text in a way that can open up the meaning of the Mass in the neutral, secular space of the concert hall. Therefore, lots of different kinds of people encounter the Mass in ways they perhaps did not expect. Again, the Sanctus takes us into the heart of heaven in the company of the angels, cited in the Apocalypse of John. Perhaps this is part of the task that Maritain had in mind for the modern Catholic artist when he saw a Catholic culture lifting our world from the ashes of the abyss, when he saw the faith animating our world as the soul animates the body, when he saw Christianity resacralizing our culture, leading the modern secular world towards the kingdom of God. So we'll place a little excerpt from the Sanctus of this Mass. Some might be surprised, indeed alarmed, that you hear things that you would not normally hear in the setting of the Sanctus of the Mass. But as I say, it's not a liturgical setting. It takes the Sanctus into a very different context. It's performed here. I can't remember who's performing, but it's one of the British performances of the work, the Sanctus from my Little Mass, sung by little people, children. Thank you very much. So to finish off, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to make a reference to a letter which I read from his captivity in Tegel prison in 1944. Months before he was murdered by the Nazis, Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a prophetic letter in which he expressed his growing sense that Christian culture was entering a new stage, demanding a response from the next few generations of believers, including the artists. He wrote, "It is not for us to prophesy the day, though the day will come, when men will once more be called so to utter the word of God that the world will be changed and renewed by it." He predicted that this would be, quote, liberating and redeeming, as was Jesus's language, which will shock people and overcome them by its power. The Sanctus at the heart of the Mass points us towards the angels surrounding the throne of God. But there is another angel in the book of Revelation who elides perhaps with Maritain's vision of modern culture, modern art, and modern music, leading, consoling, and challenging our modern world, a strange and beautiful angelic vision which may explain the necessary unsettledness and strangeness of modernity in music. The necessary and unsettledness and strangeness in my own music, perhaps. The story of the little book that gets eaten, that tastes sweet in the mouth, but bitter in the belly. And the voice which I heard from heaven spake unto me again, and said, Go and take the little book, which is open in the hand of the angel, which standeth upon the sea and upon the earth. And I went unto the angel, and said unto him, Give me the little book. And he said unto me, Take it and eat it up, and it shall make thy belly bitter, but it shall be in thy mouth sweet as honey. And I took the little book out of the angel's hand and ate it up, and it was in my mouth sweet as honey, and as soon as I had eaten it, my belly was bitter. And he said unto me, Thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sir James.